Hi, I'm Vicky Canning and I'm one of the Associate Directors at Border Criminologies. As you can see, I'm still working from home. We're not allowed into our office yet at Bristol University, but I'm going to go through some research that might be sort of helpful or to help us think differently about a key topic and a key project that I'm working on at the minute, which is called Unsilencing Sexualised Torture. Now, obviously, torture relates to more generally in legal senses is recognised as something that is undertaken by a state actor, so perhaps a prison guard or someone in a form of confinement or detention, and usually with the intention of extracting a confession or of gaining some form of information. So whenever we think about torture, we can think about things like the ticking time bomb scenario or about torture within as part of detention regimes. Likewise, in places such as Abu Ghraib or in Bagram or Guantanamo Bay. These are really common narratives of torture and obviously fit the sort of horrendous thresholds of violence against the person psychologically and also physically. The project that I'm working on at the minute wants to go a little bit further than that. So what I'm thinking about is sort of draws from earlier projects and activist work with particularly specifically women seeking asylum. And over periods of time, over sort of the last decade, whenever I've been working with women and also learning a lot from psychologists and psychotraumatologists and other people that I've interviewed, is that the kinds of violence that women had been subjected to in the home or whilst fleeing persecution, so I work specifically with women seeking asylum, mirror very much the kinds of violence that are inflicted either on the body or psychologically with people who are recognised as survivors of torture, or if not recognised, would fall into the category of survivors of torture in the context of the sort of international legal sense and the Convention Against Torture. However, quite often, whenever we think about torture, we don't think about torture being inflicted by a partner or even necessarily, as an example, growing up in Northern Ireland, by paramilitaries. So quite often in the area that I grew up, people would have their kneecaps shot as part of the conflict in Northern Ireland. But while we would talk about that as kind of paramilitary violence or as sort of sometimes even rogue violence, actually what we never really thought was it's also a form of torture. So what I'm interested in is sort of twofold. One is, how do we disentangle, or can we disentangle, the kinds of violence, the form of violence and the impact of that violence on someone with the intent of the violence and who it is that actually inflicts the violence on another person, which is obviously what most legal and international definitions focus within the realms of. So in an earlier project with the Danish Institute Against Torture, what I was sort of finding is that if organisations use narrow approaches, then support that is there for survivors of torture doesn't necessarily extend beyond those narrow definitions, and yet the impacts of the same kinds of violence, it goes well beyond those definitions. So I'd worked with women who had been held in the context of, false imprisonment by their partners or repeatedly beaten over periods of months or even years. Likewise, survivors of multiple perpetrator rape who had experienced extra forms of bodily harm, and the kind of psychological tortures that are subject to people in detention that are recognised as torture. Now, this is still the first fold, because what this brings us to is a very difficult and contentious discussion, which is, if we were to broaden the context of torture, then do we water down the role of the state? And this is what I want to really sort of find out in the project that I'm working with at the minute, because states are very rarely held accountable for their violences, and yet, as we know from scholars such as Green and Ward, they are the most numerous in inflicting harms on people, and indeed responsible for more deaths than most conventional sort of crimes or forms of violence that we would be more familiar with. So this brings me to the second fold point of this project, and what I want to be looking into is, how do we develop on a concept that I had worked around and been developing some years ago, which is torturous violence, and how can we think about the forms of torture that that have the same impacts and are the same kinds of violence, but aren't necessarily inflicted for the same reasons that torture might be in, as an example again, spaces of detention or by, for example, police actors. So how do we do that? How do we do that also in the context of recognising sexualised torture? So we know that sexual abuse can have very significant impacts psychologically, emotionally, and also physically on survivors of such violence. We know that it requires specific forms of support should people want them. And yet we also know that these forms of torturous violence are often silenced in society. So I want to find out is how are those silenced? Think a little bit more about if they're silenced within organisations and not just in society more broadly. And if so, how do we start to build languages with organisations and across even broader society to think about addressing torturous violence as seriously as we might take torture, but without watering down the impacts or the responsibility, rather really the responsibility and therefore accountability of states whenever they are engaged in manifest and institutionalized forms of torture, as we may come to recognize them more broadly in society. So that's my current project. There's many more kind of things that I've worked on with various people at Border Criminologies as well on the Border Criminologies website. But hopefully that is one point at which we can pick up a discussion and start to think a little bit more critically and outside of legal frameworks as well.